Welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast, where we deep dive into the best matches in AEW history. Brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network and your host, Sam Brown. Yes, hello, and welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sam Brown. Thank you for joining me. Every week, alongside a special guest, I take an in-depth look at one of the best matches in AEW history, taken from the definitive AEW Match Guide lists, as voted by wrestling commentators from around the internet wrestling community. If you enjoy the show today, you can subscribe and rate it on your podcast app of choice, support the podcast financially on Red Circle, and make sure you check out all of the other great shows on the Social Suplex Podcast Network, such as One Nation Radio, Keeping It Strong Style, All Things Elite, and the Grave Consequences podcast that cover all aspects of the world of pro wrestling. My guest for today is one of the original guests we've had on the show. He's a writer for Pro Wrestling Musings and a video creator at ELO Wrestling on YouTube. It's Gareth, and we're looking at the Hangman Adam Page versus Bryan Danielson AEW World Championship match from Dynamite Winter Is Coming on the 15th of December 2021. How are you going today, Gareth?
I'm very good, very excited to talk about this match. One, I've got very mixed feelings, or I had very mixed feelings about, and then as time's gone by, on a rewatch, as we've got more context, changed my mind about it, so we'll get into all of that. But yeah, I find this a very interesting match to speak about.
Yeah, this is a match that I loved a lot at the time, and I'm also very keen to speak about it because I do remember us disagreeing about it at the time, about elements of it. Obviously, this isn't the first time you've been on the podcast, Gareth, so I won't be asking you how you got into AEW again. But I did want to ask you, when I came to you with the list of, I think there's like 80 matches or so you could pick from at this point. Why did you pick this one?
Well, partially because I have changed my mind on it, or on the finish at least. I always felt the match was great, but on the finish, I've changed my mind on that, and I think there's a lot to delve into and speak about within this match. Also, Bryan Danielson is my favorite wrestler of all time, and Hangman Adam Page is probably top 3 at this point. So it's like two of my favorites battling it out. And it's one of my favorite AEW matches of all time. So that's basically why. I just love speaking about it.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. And
Yeah, look, the feeling is mutual around the two wrestlers. Bryan Danielson is the reason I got back into wrestling in 2014. When he was, igniting the wrestling world with the Yes Movement, and Hangman Page, along with Jon Moxley and Kenny Omega, have really been like my fan anchors in AEW. And I've loved the progression of Hangman Adam Page. I loved his title reign. So if that doesn't give you an idea of how glowing with praise me and Gareth might be during this episode, then I don't know what will. We will have some fair and balanced conversation, though, as we always do here on the AEW Match Guide podcast. But before we get into the match, and the first thing that we need to do is give the match its flowers. Papa Dave Meltzer, he gave this one 5 stars, 5 of the big ones. Cage match, currently rated as 9.52. And in the second volume of the definitive match guide, this match came in 4th. So that was matches between Double or Nothing 2021 and Double or Nothing 2022, the third year of AEW. So this is a match that is held in very high regard critically. I do remember it being one that graced a lot of match of the year lists when at the end of 2021, and a few people that had to rejig their lists even because this one snuck in late December when some people had already started putting theirs together. We will, of course, talk about the build to the match. But firstly, this is the first time as a podcast we have covered Bryan Danielson. Of course, last week we covered CM Punk, who was probably the biggest announcement for AEW, one of the big debutants or people that debuted at the start of this cycle of AEW. Of course, he came in August, and it was leaked around about the same time, and he hinted at a lot and pretty much confirmed at one point by CM Punk that Bryan Danielson would be coming. He of course showed up at the end of All Out coming out after Adam Cole had made his surprise debut to close off the pay-per-view and facing off with Kenny Omega. As you said, Bryan Danielson is your favorite wrestler of all time. What's your history with him? I guess, when did you get into him? How long have you been following him for? And how did you feel about him joining AEW?
So, Bryan, I first got into him when he was in WWE. I was watching it when he came into the company, but I wasn't into other wrestling at that point. I'd occasionally throw on TNA because it was on this strange channel here in the UK, and sometimes I just came across it. I was like, oh my god, another wrestling show. And then I found out what TNA was, and I was aware of like other things by the time he came in and stuff, but I'd never really gone out to check it out. But I immediately kind of just gravitated towards him. It was on that dreadful NXT reality show. He was forced to go through that, and like for some reason, like I checked that show out, and I was like, well, okay, what are they doing here then? I gravitated to him and Wade Barrett mainly, but I was really, really immediately hooked on.
Good taste.
Yeah, I was immediately hooked on Daniel Bryan as he was there, and then obviously as he grew, he just became one of my favorites. So much so, and then I went online to see people speaking about him, so much so that I actually went out and watched some of those matches which people were raving about, which massively opened my eyes to what like other wrestling could be outside of WWE. So he was like, and he wasn't the first outside of WWE I watched, because like I said, I had like watched a bit of TNA and stuff, but he was the first time I actively went out of my way to watch something else, I think. And yeah, and so I was just like, wow, this guy's amazing. And
before you get into him joining AEW, it's interesting that you discovered him through NXT and were still captured by him, because I remember at the time people thinking that, they're trying to bury him, putting him on this show, but I thought it was brilliant the way they paired him with The Miz, who was just like such an obvious foil for him, and such and even, you know, having The Miz emphasizing how much more experienced he is, and you know, really talking up how Daniel Bryan was just inexperienced. And of course, you know, that's, you know, waving red flags at the internet wrestling community who have been following this guy, you know, as a pillar of the indies in America through the noughties. You know, it's like waving a red flag at him, but it was a brilliant way to introduce him by putting him with someone who was his complete opposite and who he could so obviously and clearly build a great feud with early on. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was the main thing, because I hated The Miz. I absolutely hated him. And so having this guy come in and immediately he's kind of up against him. And I like, obviously a lot of people felt like he was being buried or whatever. I just felt like the one thing that's probably, maybe that is what they were trying to do. Maybe they were just like, this guy would be a nice little mid-carder, and, you know, it's a little shot of the internet community or whatever. But for me, like, he's just so good at playing the underdog role that I don't think you could, he's a talent I don't think you can squash, because unless you just have him go out there and lose in like 2 seconds every time or whatever. But as long as you give him the time and the platform, I think he's someone who's always going to succeed. And that's why I'd always put him on my Mount Rushmore. I'd always say he's one of like the greatest of all time. He's my favorite, but I think objectively he's one of the greatest of all time for that reason. Like, and that just, I don't know, the fact that I was gravitated towards him in that period just kind of proves that. And then obviously as he kind of forced his way into being a major star within WWE as the years progressed. They did give him opportunities to an extent, but then they also would be like, okay, we're giving you that, now we're going to take it away, and did that. Yeah. And eventually they realized what they had with him, and it was like, okay. And unfortunately he had his injury, but then he came back and he was kind of just one of the major players, as he should have been pretty much all along. But yeah, no, just absolutely love him, basically. Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny. I first came across Bryan Danielson. The first time I heard of him, it's kind of funny. It was in like 2009. Matt Hardy had turned heel and was doing the elbows, you know, like how Bryan locks them in and then rains the elbows down. And he did that. And I remember like someone saying, he stole that from Bryan Danielson. And he, like, you know, like posting a link to a YouTube video with, you know, heavy metal music and Bryan Danielson's top 25 moves or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I ever heard of Bryan Danielson. Then, of course, he came to NXT, and I kind of bowed out of wrestling around that. But as I said, he was the person that, you know, very much brought me back into wrestling. The idea of him, you know, winning the championship at WrestleMania seemed really exciting to me because I hadn't been watching wrestling, and I was like, oh, wow. I didn't think this guy would get so far. And, you know, he was kind of a guy that I was really hoping would do well. I mean, we could go on and on about his career for forever. That's a podcast in itself. But I guess the second part of my question was, how did you feel about him joining AEW? And I guess his initial presentation in the company as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was my dream move because he's my favorite wrestler of all time. And it was one I didn't think would happen. I thought, you know, he would, you know, see out his days in WWE. And because of his injury problems and stuff like that, I thought, you know, and he's got his family and stuff like that. And the fact that John Laurinaitis is married to Brie Bella's mother, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's just another thing kind of tying him into WWE.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay, he seems like he's a lifer now. And I was just like, well, at least that means whenever I do occasionally put on a WWE pay-per-view, hopefully I'll have a good match. And, you know, or he will have a good match and I'll enjoy it. And hopefully, you know, he can impart his wisdom onto some of the others and stuff like that. He was starting to get a bit of backstage influence and stuff like that. So, you know, I was just hopeful. That was basically my dream for Bryan at that point. I didn't think it was realistic that he would come to AEW. But luckily, he got that itch to do the, you know, the more pro wrestling rather than the sports entertainment side of things. And as people say, and he did decide to join, which I was really, really happy about. As soon as he had that match with Roman Reigns, it was like, okay, he's leaving and I'm fairly sure he's coming. So I had like a lot of time to get very excited about it. And then his initial presentation, I liked because like I remember a lot of people were like complaining like, oh, he's not really doing anything. He's not really like you know, he's not the character work and all that. And really, Bryan's at his best when he's just a bit of a normal bloke who likes wrestling. And I liked that. He was, you know, just a face off with Kenny Omega. They obviously had a couple of physical exchanges as well, exchanged a few words, and then they had that match, which is also one of my favorite AEW matches of all time. And that was so fantastic. And then obviously he just has great match after great match with Suzuki and Eddie Kingston, and then through that tournament as well, one with Dustin Rhodes, was it?
Yep.
And then obviously the final against Miro where he wins, which I think was supposed to be Moxley, wasn't it? But you know, we know what
we
happened
suspect.
there, so
we suspect.
yeah. And yeah, then he's here against Hangman Adam Page, and I was like, this is ideal. I didn't ever think he was going to win the title necessarily, but I was like, this is ideal. Like, this is exactly how he should be brought in. He's a top guy, especially because he had CM Punk kind of refinding himself. With Bryan Danielson, he'd just come off fighting the best in WWE. Obviously, he had a few months off, but it wasn't like he'd had 7 years off like CM Punk. They were already doing that story with another kind of guy in a similar kind of position, I guess, to Danielson. So it would have been silly to do that. So to bring him in, and especially with that, bringing in those more heel antics, I just call it Dickhead Danielson because because it sounds nice, but also it's just like he has that thing to him. He doesn't even when he's a babyface, sometimes he can do that. He can give it back to the heels. But then as a heel, he's so fantastic as well. And it was such a nice way to then transition him from that Kenny Omega match in where he still had that attitude, like I said, but he was doing it towards a heel. But then he started doing it to the likes of, you know, Dustin Rhodes, obviously, and then obviously the Dark Order as well.
And Eddie Kingston. Yeah,
exactly, of course. So when you got to the point then when it was Hangman, it was like, okay, I love you. I really want Hangman to beat him, because it's just like, yeah, it's just the way of the storytelling, I guess.
Yeah, it was interesting how there was almost like you kind of knew he was going to come, but you still weren't sure. And there's just that little bit of uncertainty. And I just remember thinking at the time, this is before he debuted it all out. I just remember being almost fed up with him like kind of talking about how he would like to.
Yeah.
Because I remember, around it was 2018 when he came back, his contract was actually up and he could have gone out then. And I remember him talking about, I'd love to wrestle people like Kazuchika Okada, Zack Sabre Jr. and listing off like these people. It's like, well, you can't do it if you're in the WWE. Like, you know how to do this. You can do this if you want. And then the second time it all came around, last year in 2021, I think at one point I was like, if he doesn't do it this time, I just want him to shut up about it because he's had a chance. And, it's not his fault because the reporters are just asking him questions and he's just answering them. Yeah, of course I'd love to, wrestle Zack Sabre Jr. and, talk, maybe we can have a fight off to see who's the best technical wrestler or, Kazuchika Okada's people are saying he's the greatest wrestler in the world at the moment. I think I am. Like, of course that's, he's just answering questions, but at the same time, it's like, you don't understand what you're doing to me, Daniel.
Yeah, I think that second time he did because he knew his contract was up. And I think then it was very much more. I remember people doing getting really upset by that. But as soon as it was like announced that his contract was up, and it was like, okay, you've suddenly started talking about. It wasn't like because he had done it before, but it was not like he had been doing it like all the time recently. And then he did like 3 or 4 interviews where he did it, and it was like, okay, you've probably told them to say something like, I can get you some good clips here, and then we can get people excited. Like, and then as soon as I think it was Fightful who broke that his contract was up, I was just like, oh, thank you. We're actually going to get it.
Cassidy Haynes was the one that. You're talking about the contract breaking. I'm thinking that Cassidy Haynes was the one that announced that he was going to be signed and show up in AEW.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I meant
he was the one that leaked that.
Yeah.
I loved that he debuted at All Out and like immediately, I don't know who did this. I don't think Daniel Bryan controls his own Twitter. But his bio just changed and all it said afterwards was professional wrestler. And I was just like, oh yeah, we're about to get some fun. We're about to get something special here. Because he's doing it literally because he wants to. He could have been a WWE lifer. They were giving him backstage power. They wanted him to stay. They even tried to work out how he could do these things with New Japan but still be wrestling for WWE. And obviously it didn't come about, but that just showed the fact that they tried to do this for Daniel Bryan shows how much they wanted him. But he just wanted to do his own thing, and he wanted to, relive the sort of experiences that he'd had and have the kind of matches that he'd got to have before he joined the WWE, and he knew he couldn't do it there. And of course showed up in AEW. I loved how straightforward it was with him. You're right about like how they didn't need to dress it up in a grander story as they did with CM Punk, and as they kind of progressed CM Punk in and he like slowly waded deeper and deeper into the AEW pool. With Daniel Bryan, it was like, nah, first match is against Kenny Omega in the biggest event we've ever had. And like in many ways that match, and I'll probably podcast about that match at some point, but that match is almost like stands as I feel almost like the crest of the surge in AEW popularity at that point, off the back of the debuts of Punk and Bryan and Adam Cole, and before that Malachi and Andrade. And it just felt like the company had so much momentum coming back from crowds and into that All Out period and into spring. But then, of course, moved into this feud after Full Gear, where he was fighting in that championship tournament, the championship contenders tournament, after he drew with Kenny Omega, which, it makes perfect sense that he was granted a non-title shot because he hadn't won anything, and manages to fight Kenny Omega to a draw. What's the next thing he's going to do? He's going to try and get back there so he can have a championship match. But of course, the championship changed at Full Gear. The champion changed at Full Gear, and Hangman won from Kenny Omega, and Bryan Danielson, his eyes became set on Hangman Page, and they entered into their little program. And it was a pretty straightforward program, but it did have a number of nice little tweaks to it. After the number one contenders tournament was complete, of course, where he would fight a member of the Dark Order each week, but they smartly and there had to be some sort of intention behind this, but each week were at a different place where there was a Dark Order hometown. So there was Colt Cabana in Chicago and John Silver in Long Island. So it really got to play up just how hot and how driven Bryan Danielson was, and how borderline, how aggressive he was getting. Like, I just remember, he kicked Colt Cabana's head in and kicked a tooth out, and he was just like, he was almost like a little kid with a lolly waiting for the camera to come back on, because I watch Fight, where you can, see the picture in picture, and he's like sitting there like cradling it like he's Gollum with the one ring, being like, you won't believe what I've got here. And then when the camera comes on, he's just like in the camera showing this tooth off that he's kicked out of Colt Cabana's head. And, he's not like super disrespectful. Like, he's not disrespectful in the way an MJF would be, but he is disrespectful in his utter confidence, in just the fact that he carried himself through that. He went through the Dark Order like they were nothing, the knife through butter, and he carried himself in front of Hangman like he did not think that Hangman could beat him.
I think that was exactly the perfect route to take, because Hangman, being this character who's constantly self-doubting himself, he's just won the championship, and then he goes, okay, who's my first challenger? And it's the guy who took Kenny Omega to a draw, so he's arguably better, and if anything, he was the one looking like he was going to win. So arguably he's better than Kenny Omega. Who's just, gone on a tear through all the, a lot of the best wrestlers in AEW, and then just beating the crap out of all of his mates. It's just like, it's a perfect challenger. You've got the side of Hangman, which is going to be doubtful of himself because of, okay, I thought Kenny Omega was the greatest challenger I've faced, and now I'm facing someone who's arguably better than him. And then you've also got the personal side of it, where it's like, he's just beating the crap out of all of my mates as well. So it was the perfect route to go. Like, I think there could have been a risk if they'd just done like, kind of relatively respectful Danielson, who just comes in and goes, look, I like you, Hangman, but I know I'm better than you. You could run the risk then of people being like, I want Danielson to win because they like Danielson, and or you run the risk of a mixed crowd. And what you got, there were still people chanting for Danielson because it's Danielson, but what you got was like very much heel versus babyface dynamic without and Danielson, even though he comes out the heel tunnel and stuff like that, but like it wasn't like there was this massive turn or anything like that. It was just a natural progression into him. Like you said, he's just very, very confident, overconfident, but it's not overconfident because he arguably is the best.
Is Bryan Danielson, yeah. Like
I say, it's just dickhead Danielson. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think of it from Hangman's perspective as well. Like, he spent, 2 years dwelling on Kenny Omega and his Hangman's failure to win the AEW Championship. And as you said, all of a sudden he's got to face someone who was arguably about to beat Kenny Omega and suddenly has to reorient himself. And of course there's, the age old adage about the championship being able to much easier to win than defend. And, he's got putting a lot of personal pressure on himself to live up to his idea of what a champion should be going into this match against such a formidable force. I don't have a whole lot more to say about the build. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that before we get into the actual match itself?
Only just quickly that a lot of people were kind of worried or complaining or criticizing that Hangman was a bit quiet in all of that build, which he was. Like, I think,
that's a fair point.
I think a lot of people wanted him to have like a match, even if it wasn't an actual defense or whatever. And I think Danielson was his first match after winning the title, which was it was quite a few weeks after Full Gear when he won it. I think people wanted him to be a bit more of a champion, and then Danielson, all of that thing to come about. And there's probably some truth in that. But generally speaking, I liked the story that they told. I just think perhaps you could have just done a little bit more with him to make it feel like, okay, he is whilst Danielson's here and he's great, Hangman is still the champion, even if he himself is having those doubts and all that. You can still show us, no, he is the guy. Which, I mean, this match and the next match as well kind of existed to kind of do, but you could have had that in the build as well. But yeah, it is what it is ultimately. I don't think it ultimately affected the match or Hangman's reign too much.
No, I don't think so either. But let's get into the match itself. Of course, it took place on December 15th at Dynamite Winter Is Coming. Second year in a row, they've had an AEW World Heavyweight Championship match at Winter Is Coming. Of course, Kenny Omega beat Jon Moxley in the AEW Championship match at the first Winter Is Coming. And at this one, it was set up for Hangman Page versus Bryan Danielson. I'm probably going to do that a little bit just out of force of habit. And Danielson was out first, gets a big ovation. Quick question. Bryan Danielson has had some, memorable themes over the years. Final Countdown, Ride of the Valkyries. What do you think of his AEW theme?
I quite like it because obviously it's got that touch to Flight of the Valkyries in the kind of remixed version. But then you've also got the clapping and obviously the chant that goes along with that kind of built into the song, which I liked as well. It was kind of a nice little mix of what he had in WWE and then what he had in Ring of Honor before that as well. So I quite liked it. I thought it was quite inventive. I think, a lot of people, they've obviously got their favorites. Because I didn't grow up with I obviously seen it, but I didn't grow up with it. Like the WWE Bryan is what I kind of grew to know more than anything else. So I wasn't too desperate for that personally. So I can understand why someone who was like a huge fan at the time, love that, maybe would have wanted that. But for me, it was a nice mix of the two. He had the, paying homage to the Ring of Honor time and paying homage to the time in WWE as well. So yeah, I quite like it. It gets me pumped every time.
Yep. I kind of like it. It felt fresh, it had a nod to the past, but it felt fresh,
Yeah.
Him Final Countdown is like classic rock and, by all accounts, ludicrously expensive to use as well, which is probably another reason they haven't even used it since. And then, of course, Flight of the Valkyries is incredible and was so well done and went so well with the yes chant. I'll never forget that moment with the cage match with Bray Wyatt or, of course, WrestleMania 30, where the song worked so well as a backdrop to the crowd just going berserk. Yeah. And I love that this has a nod to that, but also has like this fresh feeling to it. And the hip hop beat, I feel like it's got swagger to it. And it fits how confident Bryan Danielson is in AEW and sort of the fighter vibe that he has. Like this does have like a bit of fight music to it feel, with nods to the past, as you said. Hangman comes out in cow print. I love this gear for Hangman. He's always got great gear, but I particularly like this gear. He gets a massive ovation. Like it's easy to forget how completely ballistic over he was as champion, and the crowd were absolutely loving him at this point. Of course, from the get-go, as they get in the ring, Danielson just looks so damn sure of himself. I'm just sitting, he's got like, it's not quite a smirk on his face, but just this look of complete and utter confidence. I wish at some point in my life I was good enough at something that I could feel this way.
No, I loved, like I said, it's just the whole. This is my favorite version of Bryan Danielson when he has that to him, because it's so simple, but it is just like so effective. It's that old cliche. And again, Dickhead Danielson, he had these moments early in the match where he was just trying to get in Hangman's head, basically. And it's those little things that he does that, like, he knows he can out wrestle you, but he's just like doing this for the sake of it as well. Which is also part of a game plan as well, for sure, which is part of why, he's so great and all that. But like, it's also like, he knows he could just like beat you up. He could go straight. He's got the talent to just do a really good match, but he adds that character on top of it as well. And it's funny, like, when people say like, oh, Bryan Danielson doesn't have much character because he's not necessarily so overt with like crazy things or whatever, crazy gimmicks. But like the character work that he does, it's just so like it's simple but effective, like I said, and it's just you hear the crowd early in the match, especially throughout the match, but early in the match especially, just getting into it, getting all the boos. Like I said, he gets an ovation at the start because people love him, but when he actually gets into the match, people are start going, "Oh, come on, man, you're better than this." But he does those little things. It works so well.
And for Hangman's part, he doesn't back down one bit. For all we said about him, he is riding high on, the biggest win of his career, and he's ready to go. Like it's really intense from the start. The opening lockup is just so physical. They're jockeying back and forth. It looks like a real struggle. They're really putting force into it. Hangman eventually backs Danielson up into the corner. And in response, Danielson slaps Hangman on the chest as they go for the break. And then when Hangman swings in retaliation, Danielson ducks under and just gives a little finger wag and then does star jumps in the opposite corner. That's the opening part. And it's incredible how quickly they set up the outline to how this match is going to go. It's really even, super physical. Hangman's got a little bit of an edge in the athletic and maybe strength department, but Bryan is tactically a little bit ahead of the game. He's a bit of a veteran, and he's just not shy about displaying it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I like that you mentioned that Hangman doesn't back down, because I don't know how big of a narrative this is, but I've seen it a lot online. And people saying Danielson kind of controlled the start and then Hangman fought his way back in. That wasn't the case. The first 10 minutes, Hangman, going on Pro Wrestling Musings stats. I'm sure you'll get more of that when you get Craig on for the second match. Yeah. But I was looking over those, as I always do, coming into this, just to get a better idea and a visualization of exactly what went down in very simple form. Hangman has the more offense for the first 10 minutes, every single minute, I think, bar one. And that just shows he's not backing down. And Danielson is using these mind games kind of to get around Hangman's, because perhaps if you want to microanalyze on the character, perhaps Bryan actually knows how good Hangman is and not necessarily worried, because obviously he has the confidence, but he's smart enough to know I need to be smart here and I need to get in his head and stuff. And maybe because he knows Hangman isn't the strongest mentally, but again, this is all kind of microanalyzing things. I know this goes over most people's heads when they're just watching it. It's fighting, but there is that nuance with both of these guys. They bring that level of thinking into it. So those first 10 minutes really are Hangman doing more of the actual wrestling, and Danielson kind of finding his way out of it, wagging his finger, like you said. He does this thing where he offers a handshake, and then that's quite a few minutes in, and Hangman's come on, man, I'm not shaking your hand after what you've been doing.
And that's after he's done a few times where he's retreated out to the ropes and kind of laughing, taunting Hangman for it. So it's funny how his biggest and most well-known program, of course, is the Yes Movement, and that'll probably never change. That was ginormous, but that's this underdog champion fighting the man. But he's great. I reckon his greatest performances are as this kind of heel. I think Kofi Mania was probably his best performance in the WWE, and this, of course, on the Indies back in the day, that was very much what he was. Not only is he incredibly skilled and tough, but he revels in displaying that skill and winding up his opponent with it, which is what he kind of does to Hangman early on.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I've said it a couple of times, but Dickhead Danielson, just my favorite. He's my favorite version of him, and absolutely that Kofi Mania, I've always said that's the greatest performance he had in WWE in terms of laying out a match, because Kofi's great, but he's not good enough to have a match like that with anyone else, I don't think, if you know what I mean.
Well, he never has before, and he hasn't since. So
yeah.
And it's also interesting, talking about this character of Danielson, because as you said, people do say he doesn't have much character, but or he's vanilla, or I feel most people particularly people who listen to this don't give that any credence, but most, reasonable people forgot that in, 2012. But it has been something that comes up every now and again. But even, beyond, as we're saying, like this cocksure, super confident guy, when Hangman does start to get a bit of offense in, Danielson even starts to crack. Like there's this moment where it's Hangman's first bit of big offense. He gets a big boot to the chest of Danielson, and he really rocks Danielson. But you can see Danielson firstly get hurt, but then get a bit pissed off about it as well.
Yeah.
And you can see the cracks in his persona showing through that.
Yeah, no, he's I have this thing in wrestling, the best characters are always very petty. I think Eddie Kingston's incredibly petty. CM Punk's incredibly petty. MJF, all the best ones in AEW. And Bryan Danielson's the exact same. It's these little things like that. That boot, for example, might actually hurt him more than, something someone else does, which is you'd think is worse. In the mind of Bryan Danielson's character, those are the kind of things where I imagine piss him off more than if he were to get outdone by someone he respects or whatever. Not that he doesn't respect Hangman, but it's just this is kind of a match where Hangman's earning his respect, if you know what I mean. And that's a moment where I guess he gains a bit of it.
I think since you brought it up, because this was something I wanted to talk about, is do you think Bryan Danielson respects Hangman? Because in my mind, I feel like, he goes into this thinking that he's going to win. And I think part of that is that he doesn't think that Hangman is actually better than Kenny Omega. He thinks I had Kenny Omega beaten, so I can definitely take care of Hangman.
Yeah, I mean, he says as much in the build to the match. He says something like, "I'm really disappointed you won because I was really looking forward to being able to prove that I can beat Kenny Omega. But now I guess I just have to beat you and hopefully I can have a rematch with him." So there definitely is an aspect to him overlooking Hangman to an extent. Obviously, I think, again, if you're going to microanalyze a wrestler's experience as Bryan Danielson and as great as him isn't going to overlook anyone necessarily, but there's a level of confidence you have to have. If you look at great fighters, the reason why they're great is because they are humble to an extent and they don't overlook people. If you look at Floyd Mayweather, he had that cocky persona, but ultimately, he boxed very defensively whenever he came up against anyone great, especially in his later years. And worked
incredibly hard too.
Yeah, exactly. So he knew he had to do that in order to get the win. And you can still think I'm better than you, but still have the respect for someone. So that's kind of the mentality I'd say probably Danielson comes into it. Although I don't think that's not even Danielson probably wouldn't even see that as a slight on Hangman because in his head he's better than everyone.
Yeah.
So it's just okay, you're maybe you're number two. I don't think you are because I'd say Kenny Omega, but maybe you're number two. That's kind of what he's thinking. That's how I imagine what he's thinking anyway.
Yeah. Of course, we did say the story for this match is at least for the first half or so is that Danielson has that tactical edge while Hangman has that athletic edge, and that over time, as you said, it's more even than what you remember. And what you remember it being, particularly in the first 15, 20 minutes. But over time, that tactical edge does start to gain Danielson's significant advantage. He's, working on Hangman's legs and particularly his right arm to try and neutralize the buckshot, which is a thread that would continually crop up throughout all of Hangman's matches, actually, as champion, where people would work to stop the buckshot because it's such a devastating move. And there'd be all sorts of different ways that heels would, or his opponents would try and stop that. Of course, later on, Lance Archer would cut the top rope. You'd see, Adam Cole do different things as well. And as I said, doing that, the intention sort of starts to ratchet up and up and up. Danielson takes more and more control. And they did structure this match really well in terms of how it just slowly starts to build in tension, build in the level of physicality and the amount that they're selling. But my question is for you, Gareth, when did you realize that we're potentially going for an hour? Because I remember, obviously this is not going to go for, less than 20 minutes. It hits 20 minutes and, they still haven't even really wrestled outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
When did it twig to you that we might be going the distance?
A part of me felt this was going to go very long anyway, not necessarily to an hour's draw. A lot of people, well, some people had predicted that this was going to go to a draw, and I remember saying like, oh no, they won't do that. But I figured it was going to go long anyway. So in those early exchanges when it's like, okay, it looks like they're going to go long here, I wasn't too surprised, because I thought, okay, I was expecting like 40 minutes, maybe 50 anyway. And, you know, maybe they start using the idea of the draw as a thing for, you know, to heighten the drama before Hangman gets the win. And they almost did that. We'll get to that later, though. But they almost did that. But yeah, obviously, because you had the 30-minute draw with Omega, it was something that I think was on people's minds, and that's maybe another thing that's maybe a good thing with the draw with Omega, is it kind of brings out, okay, they are willing to do this in a big match, and it gives you that possibility. But I'd say for me, there was a while where like Danielson had like dominated for a little bit. Then it was like those, so obviously, like I said before, Hangman kind of had those first 10 minutes, and then in the next 10 minutes, 10 to 20, Bryan gets a lot more. Page does get a bit of offense in. He has a couple of minutes where he has more, but mostly it's Bryan, and he's having much more devastating impact over those 10 minutes. And then after that, we get to like the 20 to 30 kind of mark, where it's the actual amount of wrestling goes down as you start to see more and more, like, I guess, a bit of fatigue. Obviously not too much, because they get their second wind, I guess. But you see like the fatigue starting to set in just about. And then there's that moment where Hangman goes for the buckshot and Danielson rolls away, and that was when I was like, okay, we've still got quite a long way to go here. And there aren't really many massive spots in this match, and there hadn't been up until this moment. And then Hangman goes for a moonsault to the outside, or he's setting up for it, and Danielson pushes him off the top rope, and he like falls onto the ring apron. And that was when I was like, and then like goes towards the arm again, as you were saying. And that's when I was like, okay, we're probably in for like, I knew we were anyway, but we're probably in for a long run. This might be going like all the way, because that was already around somewhere close to the half an hour mark. And yeah, and I guess that felt like, I didn't know this consciously watching it the first time, but watching it the second time, knowing the story that was coming, this felt like your typical midpoint in a story where, you know, the hero kind of gets a bit desperate, goes for something big, and it just fails. And that's when Bryan really takes over, really starts going in on the arm after that. And obviously he's failed to hit his big shot, and then he's had a massive fall as well. So that's probably the moment I was like, the first time I was probably like, okay, maybe this will go to a draw. Because like I said, I didn't think it was going to, but it had been mentioned on Twitter beforehand by a couple of people I follow, and I was like, I didn't think, but then it was around that point I remember thinking maybe, but I still didn't think until it actually happened that it was going to happen.
Like, it's interesting. I was tracking different parts of the match just because on my rewatch, because I knew it was going to go for an hour, and it's actually not until after 10 minutes, the match has been going 10 minutes before it first spills out to the outside, and they immediately get back in the ring. And then it's actually like at 20 minutes where they first brawl around on the outside. And, you know, like most AEW matches don't take that long to brawl on the outside. Well, most of them are finished by then. So, you know, when it comes to the kickoff Dynamite match. So, you know, it was very obvious that this was going to go long. And I do like how, you know, after 20 minutes, things do like turn grittier. It's not as polished. Like both of them, their hair's starting to get a bit frazzled and out of place. They're looking a little bit more worn down. They're selling the fatigue. For me, the match really hit another level. You said when that moonsault thing happened. For me, it really hit another level when Danielson pulled in. This is about the half-hour mark or so. Danielson pulled Hangman into the post, did the spot that he did with Nigel McGuinness in Ring of Honor. That's just after what I was saying with the moonsault and the push. And then he starts really going in on that arm after that.
That's
But
where you get
do you
into the
know-
next phase of the
But
match.
I think particularly because of that, like the history that had,
Yeah.
him doing that to Nigel McGuinness and giving Nigel McGuinness like the concussion that would ultimately end his career, I was just
Yeah.
like, oh my God, they're going there. And the way
Yeah.
Hangman sold it was phenomenal. Like when I was watching this, I genuinely thought he had somehow concussed himself from the
Yeah.
way that he was on the outside. They were like giving him water. And of course, I'm watching on Fight, so I don't know that they're in an ad break. So they're kind of like probably, inside the match from them. They're like using this as a moment to catch their breath because they know
Yeah.
they're in for a long one, and they're sort of
Yeah.
taking a moment for themselves. But I'm watching it, seeing like a doctor checking on Hangman. They're giving him water. I've never seen them giving someone water in a match before. And I'm like,
Yeah.
he's concussed himself and they're working out how they can get out of this.
Yeah.
and when they came out of that, that's when I was like, oh, are we going to go? Like, is this going to go for 60 minutes? Because as Hangman sort of fires up out of that, like he was selling that so well. It looked so bad.
Yeah.
That was sort of a trigger point for me where I thought like, oh, maybe this will go for like 60 minutes, because it had been a little bit on my mind as well. I too dismissed that. I was like, maybe there's like a 2%
Yeah.
chance they do that.
Yeah. Well,
but
like-
it is something that AEW set up quite well.
Yeah.
Back in the first season, I talked about the Cody and Darby Allin feud, and how one of the things they did early on was they used that to set up the idea that there could be a draw. And it's almost like AEW used that match to show the viewers like you need to pay attention to time limits, and that time limits can become a factor. And then when Dynamite kicked off, Moxley and Pac actually had a TV time draw where Dynamite ran over. And so they like use that early to set up the fact that you can have draws. And then, of course, it starts to pay off with Omega Danielson. And then, of course, this match where you start to think, oh, this is something that could actually happen.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said about that big spot where he does the thing with the ring post, and then Hangman's on the outside taking a break. Bryan's in the ring doing his jumping jacks, just playing to the crowd and stuff like that. There's a very similar thing that Kenny and Danielson did in their match, where obviously Danielson takes the Snapdragon suplex on the ramp. Kenny beats him up a bit and then goes on the inside, patting himself on the back. Very similar. I found that really funny how like just a few weeks before that, maybe a couple of months, whatever, before that, like Danielson was on the other side of that, and now he's doing it to Hangman, which I just found was a nice little thing. But I remember thinking at the time, it was around that kind of period where I was like, like I said, that felt like a midpoint in a story. The fact they had already done that at not quite the middle of that match, but more or less the middle. That was where the match kind of changed and took a new turn in Bryan and Omega's match. So yeah, when you had that whole sequence, like you said, around that half an hour mark, I was like, yeah, okay. That's when I went from this is going to be like maybe 40 minutes to this is going late 50s if you want. But yeah, no, exactly. Basically echo everything you said. But those Bryan really likes doing that thing with the concussions, especially now that he's obviously had his issues. He loves to like tease it. He did it in the Omega match. He did it in this, and he's done it since as well. And it's just like it works me every time as well, because every time he goes into the ring, I am worried. I don't want this to be the last time I ever see him wrestle. So it's always going to get me, I think, even though he's done it quite a few times now.
Yeah, it's interesting how when this all happens, though, like, and it speaks to Danielson's character and his confidence, that he doesn't immediately capitalize on it. Like, he's got Hangman on the outside, like dead to rights almost. He could have his way with him, but he doesn't. Like, he goes back in and it's just like he wants to drive home the point of his superiority by doing those jumping jacks rather than attacking Hangman. But then when Hangman does come in, he does go like even more brutally after Hangman. There's this, there's the elbows, there's a diving knee off the apron, but there's this shot of him like stomping Hangman's head into the ring post, and it's like he's oozing the blood out of Hangman's head. It's just absolutely gross, but so visceral.
Yeah, no, I remember I remember seeing that this time on the rewatch and thinking, because that wasn't an image that like stuck with me or struck me the first time I watched it. I think because there was just so much going on. But then on the rewatch, I was like, how did I forget about this? Because this is such a good like image.
Oh, gross.
And it just perfectly encapsulates the character that Danielson is. He is the sick, sadistic dickhead Danielson.
And he's getting like so much joy out of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like he could, sit there and use his kicks and do all of his other moves that are so great, but he just wants to just all it's doing really is like pressing his head and then exposing the blood as well. But like, you can literally see that blood coming further out of his head, which then obviously gives us the great visuals of Hangman kind of later in the match as well. Once the blood's kind of dried into his hair and stuff. He's someone who bleeds really well, Hangman. It just looks so good, especially the longer the match goes and when it dries on his face and stuff.
I do love this part of the match as well. We'll move on to the, Hangman coming back shortly, but I love this part of the match for the contrast that it poses towards the end. At this point, Danielson's just toying with Hangman and he's got all the time in the world. But, later in the match, he will obviously regret these moments because he's spent time here that he could have been using to actually put Hangman away, and eventually time slips out of his control and he's no longer got control of the match. And time is now his enemy, whereas at this point he's got all the time in the world to revel in what he's doing. And when Hangman does finally come back, he does fire up. He absolutely rocks Danielson. That power and that athleticism we spoke about, and like that drive is still there. And it's almost like Danielson underestimated how deep he would go with him. Like Danielson thinks he's a shark. He's going to pull him out to deep waters and drown him. But he doesn't realize that Hangman can swim even further out than he can. And, when Hangman gets back on the offense, he's just on an absolute roll. And I just love watching him when he gets momentum behind him. Like, is there a better wrestler to watch when he's on a roll than Hangman Adam Page?
Yeah, it's hard to think of one. Some people will probably argue for Bryan Danielson, especially when he's a babyface.
Or Kenny Omega, maybe.
Yeah, and he's another one who's so easy to root for when he is a babyface, Bryan Danielson. But Hangman, I think that's part of why I love him so much. He's so good on the sell, and he does it without like overselling and stuff. He just sells like exhaustion and certain body parts and stuff very well. Whereas a lot of people will either go way too far with it or get these crazy facial expressions. And I'm like, I can see you're trying to act. Danielson, again, also does this really well. But, like, you can see what they're trying to do. Whereas Hangman, it does just feel completely natural and real.
Yep. You can see the exhaustion in his eyes. And, like, the hair's all frazzled and his big chest and shoulders are heaving. But then when he gets back on the front foot, like, everything's moving in sync. He's got a body. He's a big bloke, so he's got momentum behind him. So he hits hard, but everything's crisp and smooth.
Yeah. No, I think, and like you said, with dragging him into deep water as well. Danielson said, like, in the build-up, I'm going to drag you into deep water. It's somewhere you've never been before. You can't go long. I can go long. Blah blah blah. All that kind of stuff. He was saying that before, so they were like building up and setting up this possibility, which I guess is why so many people did say, oh, maybe they'll go to a draw, But like you said, when Hangman gets back into it, my favorite part of like, it is a comeback, but it comes from an opportunity, and I love those kind of things in wrestling where it's kind of just like by chance. So Hangman ducks when Danielson's going to kick him, and then Bryan kicks the ring post, and then Hangman sees an opportunity. Then it's kind of like something that Danielson himself would do. He sees these opportunities and he strikes them, and Hangman just really goes after Bryan's leg and knee particularly, which the commentary then say, oh look, you can see he's got the tape on that knee, so it's a knee which was previously hurt, and that isn't maybe 100% anyway. And then he's just kicked the ring post as well on top of that. So, and then Hangman really goes in on it, which I really liked. And it gave you that contrast of, obviously, Bryan's worked on Hangman's arm to stop the buckshot, whereas they'd really built up Bryan's stomps. And so now Hangman's working on Bryan's right leg to stop those stomps, and also just the kicks. And you get a spot with that later where Danielson's going for his kicks, they're not quite working as much, and then Hangman tries to respond with a lariat, but it doesn't quite work as much because they're both just so beaten down. And that's like, I think by that time, that's like a last 10-minute kind of thing before you get to the big sprint right at the end. But I just really, really love that, like, because obviously, Danielson's going to try and pick his opponent apart technically, but I really like the fact that Hangman actually, he kind of proved that something new, and he kind of, not just in terms of going deep into a match, but in terms of also just going, right, I'm just going to really go after this body part. He showed that he can have that side to him that Danielson does have, and those are the things that he was saying, is that I don't think you can do this. That's why you're a great wrestler, but I don't think you're, on my level, basically. And these little ways that Hangman found to show that he is on his level, I just really, really liked. I got that more on the rewatch. The first time, I don't know, you're always going to appreciate the actual story of a match, I think, on a rewatch, because you know the ending, and so every time there's a beat, you go, oh, that's what they're doing. Okay. And you see that more. But yeah, rewatching it, I really, really got that from Hangman, and that's when I did feel this before, but I really felt like this was such a great first performance for someone, not just who's a new champion in terms of the champion, but is a new champion. It's the first time he's holding a major championship, a major singles championship anyway. So I really like that aspect to it as well.
Absolutely. This is a match that is about time, though. And I just love the theme of time in this match. And I every time I immediately thought of the lyrics to the song Time by Pink Floyd after this match, like ticking away the moments that make up the dull day, fritter and waste your hours in an offhand way. And then it goes like on to you are young and life is long and there's time to kill today. That's like the early stages. Bryan Danielson's just got all the time in the world. Hangman's even got all the time in the world. And then one day you find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. And you run to catch up, but the sun is sinking, racing around to come behind you again. It's like, I love when it gets to 10 minutes to go, because both men start to realize, wait, hold on.
Yeah.
I've got to win this match. I've got to win this match now. And like they start to get desperate. Because, I'm a middle-aged man, so that song has started to become more and more terrifying. But for this match, like suddenly they're starting to realizing that they've missed the starting gun, and they're running, but the time's ticking away and the sun's sinking. And you get the desperation of Hangman he goes for his third moonsault. So his first moonsault works. His second one, he gets pushed off by Danielson. And even though he got pushed off on the second one, he goes for a third one because he thinks that like he's just desperate at this point. And Hangman just absolutely crashes and burns through the timekeeper's table off that. So he he's jumping off the top turnbuckle and he crashes and burns through that. But for Danielson's part, like he pulls up the ring mats, exposing the concrete. And he even pulls out a diving headbutt. And Excalibur says this line, he goes, as proud and as confident as Danielson is, it would behoove him to finish this match now. Because like even he is realizing, Danielson, in all of his confidence and arrogance, he's like, I've got to get this done, otherwise I'm going to miss my chance.
Yeah, no, exactly. And another spot that really encapsulates that as well is Danielson goes for, I think this is actually like very close to the end, isn't it? But Danielson goes for a superplex, and Hangman lands on his feet whilst Danielson kind of crashes and burns. And then those lariats that I was speaking about, Hangman trying to do earlier whilst Bryan's going for kicks, and neither of them have the momentum or the strength, and their body parts are so beaten down that they're not able to connect properly. But Hangman uses the momentum off that superplex after landing on his feet, which Bryan fails to deliver in the end, to then land a lariat, and then he's just so exhausted after that he can't quite take advantage of that. But then that's when you go into those like last 10 minutes. Both guys are throwing massive shots. Like Hangman hits, I think he hits another lariat, and they're just like generally going for the big, but not necessarily their biggest shots. And then as we get into kind of like the last 5 minutes, Danielson starts doing his stomps and stuff like that. Goes for the Bicycle knee, and then like Hangman like does this great move where he catches him and then hits the Deadeye, and then Hangman does the stomps, which is like payback from everything that obviously Danielson had done, kicking out Colt Cabana's teeth and then doing it to other members of the Dark Order. And commentary really lock in on that, and that's such a great sequence there. I love it so much because it's these guys just going for it desperately. They don't hit every big move necessarily, so those moves don't become pointless, and it's not just like move spamming. You've got nice little reversals in there, but they're basically just two guys so desperate, just throwing their biggest shots that they've got because, like you said, it's about time, and they realize time's running out. And it's one of those things, like in terms of when you try to peak a story, you want to kind of like build and build and build, and then you want this like explosion in some way, regardless of what the genre is. That explosion might come in different ways, but in wrestling, it comes. New Japan do it really, really well in these great kind of ending sequences, the last 5 minutes of a match where, you know, both guys can feel maybe the other guy's getting on top. I've got to do something, and then you just get this great. What's the word? Great.
It's
sequence.
Like a sequence of counters in New Japan, particularly the Okada matches.
And it just makes those endings to the matches so exciting to watch. But when you've built to it, you've then also got all that story on top of it. And like you said, you've got these body parts that maybe are more beaten down than you'd like them to be or whatever. Like you said, Okada does it brilliantly. Generally in New Japan, they do it well. Okada's probably the best because he's probably the best wrestler in New Japan, especially in those big matches, at least anyway. But yeah, I just absolutely love that because it was like it perfectly went along with the story, and like you're saying, that story of time as well.
Yeah, and they still manage to look exhausted as well while they're doing this. I love just a small thing with Danielson, you know, at this point.
Well, let me just say quickly, they probably are exhausted. Oh, yeah. They're not necessarily looking, you know. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it works for the story of the match.
Exactly, yeah.
I love with Danielson, like, it's just a small thing, but when he's getting Hangman in holds, he's desperate, so he's starting to, like, fish hook and, you know, get really dirty with his, you know, with what he's doing with his fingers and stuff. But then, of course, Hangman, you know, finally manages to get out on the outside and gets over, hits the buckshot lariat, but the 60-minute bell hits to signal the end of the match before he can even make the cover. It's just an electrifying final stretch. And, you know, the commentators are going off. The crowd's like on their feet for like the whole second half of this match. They're going mental. Like everything is coming together. And the commentators are doing a good job notifying the audience of the timing and what's going on. And then, of course, he misses the cover. So, like, kind of the moral win for the Cowboy, but he didn't actually win. Danielson, you know, he'll be there to rue the time that he wasted when he could have been, when he was on top. If nothing else, like, the thing that can speak for this match is it kept the audience's attention for the whole hour. Like, the crowd is engaged the whole time. They're riding the match the whole time. You know, it worked me the whole time. You know, there was points in this match where I was like, is Danielson going to win? The first time I watched it through, even though, you know, I would have bet large money that Hangman would not lose in his first defense. This guy who, like, the story of the promotion to this point has been him becoming champion, but there was moments in this match where it got me, and I was engaged the whole time, even on rewatch, which is, you know, for an hour-long match, that speaks very highly. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I was like, before I watched it back, I was kind of like, because I had like quite a busy day before, and I only had like this kind of small window. I say small window, it's just over an hour, where I was like, I need to watch it, and then I need to go and do something else. And I was just like, I wasn't dreading it, but I was just like, a whole hour, is it going to stand up? I was really worried that it wouldn't.
Yep.
And then
I
after,
felt the same way. I was like, oh
Yeah.
man, I'm gonna have to sit down. It's gonna take an hour. And
yeah,
it's gonna be, by the time I finish, it's gonna be time to go to bed.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, but like as soon as Brian's music hit, then I was like, okay. I got excited again. And then as soon as the match like gets properly going, I was just hooked. Then at that point, almost like I was watching it the first time. Although obviously I was kind of trying to look out for things to try and pick up things to speak about for this podcast and stuff. But like I was hooked and I was like engaged as well. And it's like there are some matches where like, so for Pro Wrestling Musings, I used to write like this column about like just the stories of a match and going over it. And there were some matches within that where I was like, okay, I'm going to write about this one. I'm really excited to do it. I'll rewatch the match. And then I'm like, this isn't as good as I thought it was. But this one, if anything, it increased my appreciation for the match, even though I'd already started to change my mind on my initial reaction to the result. Did you want to speak about the result of the draw?
Let's talk about that, because I love the fact this was a draw, but at the time it wasn't as universally loved. And you yourself, you were, I wouldn't say scathing, but it came across when I read your Twitter, it came across as you really disliked it. The fact that it was a draw. So talk to me about that. Like, and you've said you've now changed your mind on that.
Yeah.
But just talk to me about that.
So I mean, basically, I just got worked. Is is the reality of it? But like, my point and my rationale at the time was they had this amazing match and then it ends in a draw. If you have Hangman make the cover, that's the perfect match. So yeah, this is a great 4.75, but we had the perfect 5-star match. I maybe even would have broken my own scale if he had just won. That's kind of what I was saying and my reasoning for it. And then kind of the more I thought about it, especially, by the time we had the second match, I had already changed my mind. But then the more and more I thought about it, because that was just my initial reaction. I was just like, as someone who just really wanted Hangman to win and was very invested, I was just disappointed, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is probably an extent to which you can say if they have Hangman win, maybe as a single match, you could argue that that's better. Some people would argue that it wouldn't make a difference. Some people would argue that maybe it's worse because like this is the story at hand ultimately. But what you've always got to remind yourself as a viewer is that your job, as much as we like to look into things and analyze things and stuff like that, your job is ultimately to just watch the story that they're telling rather than be like, oh, this is what they should have done. So even though sometimes there are valid cases where it's like, okay, they clearly shouldn't have done that, and that's fine, you know, sometimes they make mistakes or whatever. But in this, like, eventually I just reminded myself that, okay, what's actually the story here? Okay, they're clearly going to have a rematch, and that's obviously where I think Hangman was always going to win that, and the way they handled that rematch was so great, and it showed how Hangman had grown, and that's why I completely forgave it after that. I'd already pretty much forgiven it, but after they had that match, I was like, okay, you nailed the perfect rematch of what I would have wanted. Not in terms of the perfect match necessarily, because neither of these were necessarily the perfect match, but together they kind of made this great story of Hangman kind of, he's risen to the challenge of Kenny Omega, and then he had to rise to the challenge of Danielson. A lot of people really wanted Hangman's first defense to be MJF to screw him, and Hangman gets screwed again. And I think this draw was a really good way of kind of doing that. Hangman had the match won, and he doesn't get screwed in a way that MJF cheating is screwing him. But it's just like, you were so close, and you had the match won, but it was just an issue of time. Like you say, he's still got
a point to prove afterwards.
Yeah, but he's also within the match. He's proven that he can rise to the level of Danielson. He can at worst match him, and really, if that match had gone another 10 seconds, he makes the cover and he gets the win, presumably anyway. That's the story they kind of leave you with, or the feeling they leave you with. But yeah.
Well, I'll give you my rationale for liking, because I immediately liked that this was a 60-minute draw. That immediately was something that got me excited. And I think for a few reasons. Firstly, I feel like, at least to me, the 60-minute draw is particularly a championship match, is something that is almost historic in its nature. Like, it's not something that happens regularly, and it's something that only the greats get to do. Like, it's I think 60-minute Broadway for the championship, and I immediately think Flair Steamboat, and that is like literally some of the greatest matches. Yeah. For any critic who worth his salt or wrestling historian, like, they are some of the greatest matches that have ever been wrestled, particularly for their time. They were incredible. And you know, like, having a match that sort of gets in the pantheon of that immediately makes me happy, particularly when it's two of my favorite wrestlers. And, you know, I think, you know, Punk and Joe, they had those 60-minute matches in ROH. Danielson's had 60-minute matches before. And this is Hangman getting a chance to, like, really put his name up as one of the great working champions by pulling out this thing, which is really difficult to do, like a 60-minute match that keeps people engaged. As you said, like, we knew that this match was good, and both of us were like, oh man, really not looking forward. Well, not looking forward, but like, oh man, do I have to watch this match again? Can I just watch the highlights clips or something? You know, because 60 minutes is a long time for a wrestling match. But if you can do it well, man, that speaks so highly of your work. And also, I think the other reason, if they had done this without first laying the groundwork, as I said, of like the Cody and Darby draw, where they showed that, like, yes, we can have draws. And then, you know, upping the stakes again with Omega and Danielson, like, oh, we'll do draws in like a really big setting. And then it's like, okay, what's the biggest possible way that you can do a draw? A 60-minute championship match. We'll do a draw for that. Like, if they just pulled this out of nowhere and those other things hadn't, like, led up to it and set the groundwork for, like, this is something we do in this promotion, it would have felt like it was possibly trying a bit too hard. And I think if that was the case, I may not have liked it as much. But in the broader context, and as I said, the historical context, I love the fact that it was a draw for that reason.
Yeah, no, that's like, and like you are right as well. Like, as I say, eventually I stopped being so worked up by it.
Well, you feel like how Hangman feels, right? Like, Hangman
exactly.
Just feel like...
I think I had I had the correct response in terms of what an audience should be feeling. You should be feeling disappointment. Maybe I worded it like, oh, they should have done this, and then it would have been the perfect match. But I should have been feeling the way I felt at the time. Yeah. Like, I feel like if you're happy with it immediately, as you were, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But I think me being so disappointed is like, that's the kind of feeling Hangman wanted people to feel. That's the kind of feeling AEW wanted people to feel, because that shows that they've invested you, which is good. The problem is some people they get their investment and then they go online and they just complain, which I did. But I did change my mind, and I did, then praise it afterwards as well, once I kind of calmed down. But
I wouldn't say you were wrong to feel the way you felt, and you didn't, you're on this podcast, you're someone who I talked about wrestling to a lot. I know you're not like doing it in bad faith. It was genuinely how you felt, and that you weren't the only person that felt that way. Sort of on the topic, because I brought up the historical legacy, how do you think this compares to other 60-minute matches? I mentioned Flair Steamboat, of course, the Iron Man match, Hart Michaels at WrestleMania, Omega Okada 2 that is a 60-minute draw that's quite well known and recently, and then one that I thought of randomly is the Iron Man match that John Cena and Randy Orton had. Of course, I mentioned before like some of the Punk Joe stuff. There's lots of 60-minute matches out there. I think like Wheeler Yuta and Daniel Garcia had one earlier that year. But well. where does this rank for you amongst those?
Well, I haven't seen all of them, but in terms of, like, for example, what I was going to say was Omega Okada. I found that it was interesting they did it because obviously Danielson's name dropped Okada many, many times, and then Omega and Hangman obviously have their history. It was very much like, AEW kind of setting up, and obviously in the third match, which came after the draw in Omega Okada. In the third match, Omega gets the win in under half an hour, which, of course, I can't remember exactly what the match time is for Danielson Hangman 2, but it's around half an hour. So there's potentially a third match, which kind of then it sits similarly with what they did. They could go, maybe there's no time limit and then they do over an hour or something like that, which would be just copying. But like, I do like that there are those parallels with that there, because obviously Omega is such a big part of Hangman's story, and Okada isn't a big part of Danielson's story, although Omega had become just a couple of months before that as well. But it was something which Danielson is up there. He's on the level of those guys. Everyone recognizes that. So this is kind of like for Hangman, this is kind of like what Omega did in having that draw. And it was when, I think someone said on Twitter, it's kind of just like that. Like, I didn't watch Omega Okada live at the time, the second match. I didn't watch it live at the time. But I'd like to think that at the time I would have just been like, okay, there's a vision here. Maybe I wouldn't have been if I got too invested like I did with this one. Maybe I would have been just angry that Omega didn't win. But I think maybe they handled it in a different way where and I don't know, because I knew it was a draw when I went to watch that match, it's hard for me to comment on it because I didn't watch it without knowing the result to begin with. But yeah, it has a feeling of it's that kind of moment for Hangman. And I think you do need these moments and these matches in your catalogue as a wrestler to kind of build that legacy. And it's not necessarily about winning or losing, whatever, with wrestling. Obviously, with the story, that's a huge part of it, but it's about the things you prove along the way, the stories you tell. They're the main things which I think when you go 30 years into the future, when we look 30 years back, we think of, those matches that tell those stories and those wrestlers who told those stories. I'm sure there's loads of great wrestlers who have been not forgotten, but they don't get spoken about as much. Because whilst they maybe won loads of matches in their time and stuff, maybe they didn't have that connection. They didn't tell those stories. For example, Dusty Rhodes gets spoken about so much, but there's people who won more championships or maybe were considered bigger stars who don't get spoken about as much from that era as well. But it's because he connected and he left a legacy, like I said, that went beyond just I was the champion so many times or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's hard to rank. Yeah, I asked you. I kind of asked you an unfair question, to be honest.
Yeah. It's not as.
I find it hard to. I find it hard to rank them because this is. Yeah. Like I remember, I did watch that Cena Orton one that I mentioned live. But the other ones as well were matches that I came to knowing the result, not watching live, in the moment. So it is hard. Like it is hard to compare, but this ranks up there with them, is what I'll say. And as I said, like. It's a legendary thing to do this. And I think for like Hangman's title run, like this showed his heart, his fighting spirit, like his ability to just go and go and go, the motor that he's got, and just being able to show that he could hang with Danielson and nearly had him beat in 60 minutes. Like that's for his legacy historically. I think this match is really important. This is something that he can. The story with Omega, of course, is huge, and that's like the story of him for like 3 years. But then to follow it up with something like this is, something he can really hang that cowboy hat on. Yeah,
and it was something different as well. Like we'd had all that Omega stuff, and it was like, now he's the champion. What is this going to look like? And we didn't just go into, okay, he's going to win 10 matches, where the title is on the line. And then he'll lose it to someone, and that'll be it. Because there are title reigns which are kind of like that, and it's just a collection of matches, and some of those matches might be really good. But with Hangman, it's kind of like match to match. Every time he kind of comes on the screen, not necessarily there's a massive difference or whatever, but it's always leading on from what happened before. So obviously then we had the second match where Hangman then goes and proves no. I am better than you, and he goes and wins that in much more convincing fashion. And then he gets someone like Lance Archer, where it's like a totally different proposition. Danielson's smaller than him, more technical. Archer's bigger than him. He's a monster. And the way in which they approach that as well, I'm sure you'll probably end up speaking about that match at some point because it was a fantastic one on the podcast. So we won't go into it. And we've also, speaking about time, we've been going for quite a while. But it's a completely different thing. And then he gets Adam Cole, which is like there's it's more of a story between two guys where,
two Adams.
used to be friends. Yeah, two Adams used to be friends and stuff like that. So all these different challenges that he had to face, which I really, really liked. And this kind of just set the tone for that. It was like, okay, It is something new, but it is still a continuation of the story of Hangman, which I really, really liked about it. But like you said, it's vital for his legacy, I think.
And I think it set the tone for his title run that, like, when he has a championship match, it's going to be box office stuff. Like, his matches are going to be something that you pay attention to. I almost liken it to, he didn't get to go as long. And, we'll get to the point where we talk about Hangman versus Punk at some point. That'll break my heart a little bit. But he was on, like, the kind of run that, like, Kazuchika Okada had when he had those matches with Kenny Omega. But, like, that was another reign where, like, he had to go up against someone who was athletic like Kenny Omega and, a giant like Bad Luck Fale or a technical wizard like Zack Sabre Jr. or, just another dynamic star like Tetsuya Naito or, his eternal nemesis, Hiroshi Tanahashi, and like all these different styles of matches, but every single match means so much. And has so much effort put into it and thought put into it, and every match is box office. Even Okada versus Bad Luck Fale, it's something that you want to sit down and watch and savor, and you pay attention to, and you can dig into, and that's what this match set the tone for with Hangman's title reign. And as you said, like the other matches as well that he would go on to have. We are running out of time quickly. Ourselves, we have been doing too many star jumps, and it's time to call it a wrap, I think. I really enjoyed talking about this match, though, Gareth. I'm so glad that you came around on this match because I adore it. I adored the rewatch, and I'm glad you did too. But where can the good people find you on social media if they want to talk to you about this match or anything in wrestling?
So you can find me at Gareth_EW on Twitter, or you can also follow me at Eno Wrestling. I will get back to actually doing stuff on there at some point. It's just finding the time, but I will. It will happen. But yeah, I guess for now, just follow me on at Gareth _EW on Twitter.
Yep, and I do thank you for coming on today. It's been a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to have you, my dear listener friends, on. As Gareth sort of dropped there, next week we're having a double dose of Hangman Danielson. I'll be talking to Craig Williamson about Hangman Page versus Bryan Danielson number 2, and we'll be digging into the second match that these two had. So make sure you don't miss that. Make sure you come back, hit subscribe, hit follow, or whatever your podcast app says. If you've enjoyed what you listened to today, please do rate and review. That just helps us show up when other people are looking for podcasts. And why not tell a friend? Tell someone about our podcast. I think this is a really great podcast to listen to. I think it's something unique that not many other people are doing. So why not tell someone if you've enjoyed what you've listened to today? And if you want to talk to me about AEW matches, I would love to hear from you. You can find me on Twitter, Sir_Samuel, or you can even email me if you're a bit old school and don't have Twitter, sambrownmedia@gmail.com. But as I said, I will be back next week where we'll be talking about Bryan Danielson versus Hangman Page for the AEW Championship number 2. And I cannot wait to get stuck into that as well. But until then, I will catch you guys later. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Gareth, for coming along today. And I will see you all again next. Thanks for listening to the AEW Match Guide podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then you can subscribe on the podcast app of your choice so you never miss an episode. Also, feel free to let me know on Twitter at Sir_Samuel. I'd love to hear from you. The AEW Match Guide podcast is brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where you can find many other fantastic podcasts discussing not just AEW, but all parts of the world of professional wrestling. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Sam Brown.
Tired of long waits and rushed care at the ER and urgent care clinic? Next time, stay home and let Dispatch Health bring the power of the hospital to you.
I call Dispatch Health. A care team of medical professionals actually come to your house.
They're the same caliber of people that you would see if you were at a hospital or an urgent care.
Dispatch Health can treat most non-life-threatening emergencies.
They can do the x-rays, they can do stitches,
urinary tract infections, blood test, urinalysis, ultrasound.
It's almost everything that they can do at the ER.
You never feel rushed. They're there for you and only you.
I felt like their only patient.
And it costs no more than a trip to urgent care because Dispatch Health is covered by most insurance, including Medicare. See if we serve your home at dispatchhealth.com.
Dispatch Health really went above and beyond.
It's wonderful to have care come to your home.
House calls are back, and they're better than ever. Learn more at dispatchhealth.com.